It all happened so quickly. Joseph was looking forward to meeting up with his brothers. He hadn't seen them for several weeks. They were taking care of his father's sheep far from home. No sooner had he spotted them and ran to greet them, he found himself in the circle of name-calling and teasing as they pushed him back and forth, laughing, and it started to get rough. He begged them to stop. Then someone ripped off his favorite cloak and began a game of how he might be found dead, torn alive by animals. Two grabbed his arms and two his feet and began swinging him over a deep, dark cistern. Joseph wasn't sure if there was water in it, and then they let him go. And as he passed, he saw the green moss of this cistern, and he lands with a thud on the ground, on the sand. Is this really happening to me? As his attention takes in his new reality, he hears them arguing about what to do with him. There is a kind of eerie green light in his new prison. It was like being underwater. He cannot believe what they're doing. Wait till his father hears about this. And it's a mixture of anger and disbelief beating in his breast. How could they do this to me? Night falls, it gets dark and cold. He shivers without his cloak. He is totally alone. He recalls the scene of the day over and over in his mind. It's a bad dream. He must wake up. They will let him out in the morning. It's a joke, right? And as the hole above him changes from pitch black to yellow and red, he hears foreign accents, the sounds of camels and donkeys, clinking pots, and only a few brothers remain to pull him up out of the deep. He is blinded by the morning sunlight. He can't see what's going on. Something about what a fine exotic specimen he is and what price he will fetch in the flesh pots of Egypt. He hears the thud of a bag of silver coins hit the ground and squabbling over the final price. Human trafficking is an ancient business. They blindfold him and lead him off into the desert with the familiar sound of name-calling and bullying from his older brothers. He will never forget these sounds, but in a deep, unspoken bitterness, the brothers will blot out every memory of his existence. He simply left them, and the chaos of their family moved towards an agreeable equilibrium for now. So that's the kind of backdrop of this remarkable story that we know well. We know the Joseph story so well, and it closes the last couple of chapters of Genesis. And it's a very interesting story because we find there is a kind of remarkable shift from the beginning of Genesis, where you have this all-powerful God who creates life from the chaos of the waters, and earth is formed, and humankind and creatures are formed, and then this all-powerful God rejects Adam and Eve from the garden for their sin, and then this all-powerful God almost destroys all of creation and makes a deal with Noah. You move from that God at the beginning of Genesis to a God that is relatively absent from the story of Joseph. And there isn't these remarkable conversations that God has with Abraham or Isaac or Jacob. Instead, you have this kind of pretty alone character, this kind of narcissistic, spoilt brat who's got this thing about the world revolving around him, who suddenly finds himself in a very different world, in the pit. And what's very interesting about these last chapters of Genesis is that this all-powerful God appears to be very absent from this family that God is fascinated with. And what God does is God works on the character of Joseph. And that's what is remarkable. The detail in the story, the scholars aren't sure, was Joseph a real historical person, or is he a kind of tribal mythological figure in which there is enormous wisdom about family life, about what it means to be a nation, what it means to be an outsider, and our relationship as individual, family, and nation with God. And lots of detail in this story. And in the other way, he's kind of, Joseph is almost the prototype of the American dream. He comes from a difficult beginnings, and he ends up the number 2 in his country. He becomes the right hand to Pharaoh. And he has this remarkable ability to understand the unconscious. And he uses that not only for his own benefit, he makes a lot of money, gains a lot of power by doing that, but he also does a lot of good with that. And so the Joseph story demands our attention. And the question is how God is involved in the shaping of this character. And in a way, God is not absent from the story, but God is kind of incarnated in the Joseph story. He is very much the Hamilton of his day. And he is successful. He marries an Egyptian, the daughter of a religious leader in Egypt. He has 2 sons. And to the world, he looks successful. And he avoids the 7 years of famine. He plans ahead. All of the countries around Egypt depend on them to survive this horrible famine. But there is something missing in Joseph's life. There is a deep wound that began in that pit. And all his success and all his family life and all the acclamation that he's getting cannot repair that experience of being in that pit and being betrayed by his own brothers. There's a wonderful book, I've referred to it a number of times. It's called God, a Biography by Jack Miles. It's in our library. He says this: though Joseph does prosper indirectly with the Lord's help, what he directly accomplishes is the rescue of an entire social order in which he is an outsider. The Lord's promises and intervention in the lives of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob involved them in their families only. Here, the divinely aided dream interpretation saves all of Egypt, and only because of that larger success is Joseph, with his enhanced personal power, able to rescue his family. The Lord announces no intentions for Joseph, as he did for Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and theirs, and for that matter, God has no intention for Egypt that he implements. So the story of Joseph and his brothers is a moving and accessible one for modern readers, not just because of its undeniable literary artistry, but also because of this modern absence from it of a powerful and intrusive God. In the Joseph story, as in a modern post-religious society, God is remote. But his remoteness matters little, for he is thought of only fleetingly, in crisis moments, when his help is sought to escape from some dilemma or avert some catastrophe. Modernity expects no surprises from God, speaks of him calmly, as Joseph does, and assumes whatever God's power, his intentions are benevolent. God is kind, as Joseph is kind. And I love this kind of relating Joseph to our contemporary secular society, where God is not that kind of engaged. And, we use God in the church when we want to get baptized or married or hatch, match, and dispatch. So Joseph speaks to our age. And I think it's really interesting how the movement is from this all-powerful, intrusive God at the beginning of Genesis to the development of moral character in this one person who does a lot of good quietly and saves a nation and saves his family. There's also an aspect of the story. We know he becomes, from the sort of naive 17-year-old thrown in the pit, he becomes a very astute political person. He figures out the way of the world. And he works out a scheme that when his family come hungry and looking for grain, he knows who they are, but they don't know who he is. He is the family's dirty little secret. And they don't even know who he is. But he sets up this game where he accuses them of stealing from him. And ultimately what he's trying to do is to see 20 years later if his family have learned anything from what they've done to him. And the way he does it, he says, well, I'm going to hold your youngest brother, Benjamin, ransom. And the family, the brothers realize, and they remember what happened to the father. It broke his heart when Joseph disappeared. And they don't want the father to go through that again. And there's this wonderful moment in the story where one of the brothers steps forward. It's Judah, who says, no, we won't do that. We don't want our father to go through this trauma again. I will remain here. I will be the ransom in his stead. And we'll let Benjamin go. And it's that moment where Joseph loses it. He totally breaks down. And there's this moment of kind of major cathartic kind of reconciliation. Because the game that he's playing, he's testing them to see if they've learned anything from what happened to him. And will they change their behavior? And there's a wonderful book by William Countryman called Forgiven and Forgiven. He's a New Testament lecturer in Berkeley in California. And he lays out this model of reconciliation following the Joseph story. And it's a kind of conditional reconciliation. And basically it's about that if somebody says, I'm really sorry for what I've done, and if I were to do the same thing again, I would do it differently. And that is very much the model, the framework of the Joseph model of reconciliation. And when Joseph realizes that Judah, who is actually the ancestor of Jesus, it's very interesting that Jesus is related by blood to Judah. So this is the ancestor of Jesus sacrificially stepping in the place. And that moment opens up Joseph's heart, and he reconciles with his family. I remember in terms of my own journey, I was kicked out of a church in Dublin, and I carried that wound for 20 years. It was horrible. I was made a canon in Los Angeles in like 2002, and the church that I was kicked out of, the present rector wrote to me and said, oh, congratulations for being a canon, blah, blah, blah. Next time you're in Dublin, come and preach. We'd love to see you. And the guy who kicked me out was now the Archbishop of Dublin, so was this guy's boss. So I said, thank you very much, Michael. Love to come over, but you better check with your boss first. And so what followed was an amazing kind of sequence, not unlike the Joseph story, where the Archbishop of Dublin wrote me an email of apology. And he said, I'm really sorry for what I did to you. And if I were to do it again, I would do it very differently. And that was a transformative moment. And I just read this book, Forgiven and Forgiving, and it was the Joseph model of forgiveness and reconciliation. It was the words that I would do it very differently, that saw that his apology was genuine. And so I went over to Dublin, and we just picked up where we left off, and we became friends, and I kind of let go of all that baggage. And it's interesting in the Joseph story, when he reconciles with his family, he doesn't blame them. It's interesting that his interpretation 20 years later, she said, well, it wasn't that you sold me into slavery, but God had a bigger mission in mind for me. I had to help this country deal with a famine. And I had to kind of move away from you for a bigger picture. And I also had to save my family. And it's a kind of wonderful way in which he pulls out the telescopic lens and sees his life has much more meaning and purpose. And he's able to let go of that resentment and that pain. So there is a lot in the Joseph story, not only in terms of our own families and the pain and the wounds and the trauma that we all have and the secrets that we have in our family. The Joseph story is enormously rich and powerful. And it offers us this kind of unconscious, the way in which the dream aspect, the unconscious aspect, that is also part of today's gospel. I interpret the walking on water, I make a joke that I missed that class in seminary. I can't walk on water. But actually, if the water is frozen, we can all walk on water. But that story is kind of like the story of Joseph. It is about the unconscious. It's about the unconscious for the community of Jesus that may be going through a really difficult, frightening time. In Matthew's gospel, we know that John the Baptist has just been beheaded and that Jesus is kind of figuring out he may be next. And so he's pulling away from the movement and the people, and he's isolating himself, and yet he still feels in his heart they're like sheep without a shepherd. He has to feed them. There's the feeding of the 5,000, and then Matthew reports this miracle. And for the Jews, the sea is always about chaos, and it's about the unconscious, and it's also about the place of most creativity out of which God creates all that is. So I see in some connections, the gospel is also, Peter is very much in the pit as Joseph is in the pit. And a way in which we have to keep our eye on this character of Jesus, who is in many ways the epitome of the non-anxious presence. When all around us is chaotic and our lives and what seems to be precious to us is threatened, how do we maintain a kind of non-anxious presence and give confidence to the people around us and know that God is still in charge? God is still in charge, and the character of God is still being created and recreated in us, God's children. So there's enormous wisdom in these readings today, a way to deal with betrayal and abandonment, the pit of despair, how we become better, more compassionate people through life's challenges and storms, and how we find a way to live with our own disappointments and failures, how all of this forms the characters that we become in God's work in us. Amen.